She was supposed to be a nobody, a tired waitress pouring cheap wine in a fading diner that smelled of bleach and stale garlic. He was the city's worst nightmare, a man who ordered executions between bites of veal. When he muttered a filthy, degrading insult in an obscure Sicilian dialect, expecting her to blush and walk away, he didn't expect what came next. She didn't cry. She leaned in locked eyes with the devil and fired back in perfect venomous Italian. The kitchen of Trattoria Rossi smelled like a slow death by cholesterol. It was a suffocating blend of scorched garlic, rancid olive oil, and the sharp chemical bite of industrial floor cleaner. Lucy stood near the dish pit, letting the industrial fan blow hot, greasy air across the back of her neck. Her uniform shirt clung to her shoulder blades. The soles of her cheap black shoes stuck to the linoleum with a sickening shh sound every time she shifted her weight. It was a Tuesday night. The rain outside was relentless, turning the Chicago streets into black mirrors and keeping the normal dinner crowd at bay. Lucy's lower back throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache that kept time with her pulse. She was running on 3 hours of fractured sleep, half a bagel and 2 cups of coffee that tasted like battery acid. She just needed $20 more in tips to cover the gas bill. Just $20, and she could go back to her cramped apartment, lock the deadbolt, and pretend the world didn't exist. "They're here." The voice belonged to Gianni, the floor manager. He pushed through the swinging kitchen doors, his face the color of spoiled milk. He was a man who usually moved with the arrogant swagger of a local tyrant, but right now, he looked like a cornered rat. Sweat beaded on his receding hairline. He was frantically wiping his hands on a stained rag. "Who?" Lucy asked, not looking up from the tray she was loading with cheap silverware. "Falco," Gianni hissed, grabbing her elbow. His fingers dug into her skin. "Matteo Falco and his crew. They just took the back booth." Lucy's hands paused. The clinking of the silverware stopped. Everyone in the city knew the name Falco. You didn't read it in the papers. You heard it whispered in the meat-packing district, murmured in the back rooms of dive bars, and spat like a curse by the local cops. Matteo Falco wasn't just a mobster. He was the architect of the city's underbelly, a man who had inherited a crumbling empire and rebuilt it over the bones of his rivals. "So give them to Maria," Lucy said, yanking her arm away. She resumed tossing forks onto the plastic tray. "Maria is crying in the walk-in cooler." Gianni snapped his voice, cracking. "She spilled water on his brother last year and still thinks they're going to put her in a foundation. You're taking them. Go. Don't look them in the eye. Don't ask stupid questions. Just pour the wine and get out." Lucy gritted her teeth. The exhaustion was a heavy, wet blanket over her anger. She didn't have the energy to argue. She grabbed a fresh white cloth, draped it over her forearm, and pushed through the swinging doors into the dining room. The atmosphere in the restaurant had fundamentally shifted. The low hum of conversation from the scattered tables had evaporated. People were staring fixedly at their plates, cutting their manicotti with robotic precision, terrified to look toward the back of the room. The air felt thick, heavy, with an unspoken threat. Lucy navigated the narrow aisles. As she approached the corner booth, the smell of cheap restaurant garlic was overpowered by the scent of expensive things, sharp cedar, rain-dampened wool, and the faint, unmistakable metallic tang of gun oil. There were 3 of them. 2 massive men in tailored suits sat on the outside edges, their eyes scanning the room, with the lazy, detached vigilance of guard dogs. But it was the man in the center of the leather booth who sucked the oxygen out of the space. Matteo Falco wasn't cartoonishly large, but he occupied space like a black hole. He leaned back against the red vinyl, his dark overcoat draped over the seat beside him. His suit was charcoal, cut to perfection, hiding the violence beneath it. He had a face carved from granite-hard angles, a sharp jawline, darkened by a shadow of a beard and eyes the color of an empty street at midnight. He looked exhausted, rubbing 2 fingers against his temple as the man across from him spoke in hushed, frantic tones. Lucy stepped up to the table. She didn't tremble. She didn't cower. She was simply too tired to be afraid. "Good evening," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the forced customer service cheer. "Can I start you with something to drink?" The 2 guard dogs stopped talking. They looked at her like she was a stain on the tablecloth. Matteo didn't even look up. "A bottle of the Barolo," he said, his voice a low, gravelly scrape that vibrated in the quiet room. He didn't gesture. He didn't glance her way. "And bring the veal, all 3, rare." "Right away," Lucy said. She turned on her heel, the sticky soles of her shoes peeling off the carpet, and walked back to the kitchen. She felt the heavy gaze of the men on her spine, but she kept her shoulders rigid. Just $20. That was the mantra. When Lucy returned with the wine, the tension at the table had escalated. The man sitting across from Matteo, his younger brother Enzo, judging by the similar but softer jawline, was leaning forward. His face flushed red. "It was a mistake at the docks, Matteo," Enzo was saying, his voice tight. "The port authority shifted the schedule. We couldn't get the crates out in time." Matteo leaned forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, but it made Enzo flinch. Matteo picked up his water glass, tracing the condensation on the rim with a calloused thumb. "I don't pay you to give me weather reports, Enzo," Matteo said quietly. The softness of his voice was far more terrifying than a shout. "I pay you to move the cargo. Now I have 3 tons of rotting product sitting in a warehouse and a buyer who thinks I'm going soft." Lucy approached the table, the heavy bottle of Barolo in one hand, the corkscrew in the other. She needed to interrupt, to open the wine, but every instinct she possessed screamed at her to stay back. She swallowed hard, tasting the stale coffee in the back of her throat, and stepped into their peripheral vision. She presented the bottle to Matteo. He didn't acknowledge it. He just kept staring at his brother, his dark eyes, hollow and unforgiving. Lucy pulled the foil, sank the screw into the cork, and pulled. The soft pop sounded like a gunshot in the tense silence. She reached over to set the cork on the table. As she leaned in, her hip bumped the edge of the heavy wooden table. It was a tiny movement, a millimeter of a slip caused by exhaustion, and a blister on her heel that had just burst. The water in Matteo's glass sloshed, a single drop spilling over the rim and hitting the pristine white tablecloth. The argument stopped. Matteo finally looked at her. He didn't look at her face. His gaze dragged slowly from her scuffed, non-slip shoes, up the cheap black polyester pants, past the stained apron, and settled on her collarbone. The dismissal in his eyes was absolute. It wasn't anger. It was a profound, deeply seated disgust. She wasn't a person to him. She was an inconvenience, a clumsy piece of machinery. He turned his head slightly toward Enzo. When he spoke, the language shifted. It wasn't standard musical Italian. It was Sicilian, and not the polite modernized Sicilian they taught in university courses. It was the harsh, swallowed, guttural dialect of the Palermo backstreets. It was a language of scraped consonants and clipped vowels, a language designed to be spoken behind closed doors. "Talia, acista," Matteo muttered, his voice dripping with aristocratic boredom. "Look at this." Lucy froze. The wine bottle in her hand suddenly felt like it weighed 50 pounds. Her breath hitched, catching sharply in her chest. He kept talking, the cadence rolling effortlessly off his tongue, fully confident that the pale, tired American waitressing in a dive restaurant couldn't understand a single syllable. "Na bestia morta di fame. Ciull'ordia ca femmina," he continued, leaning back. "A starving beast. More dirt than woman." He waved a hand dismissively toward her. Quando finisci di fare da maggio, falla fora. Mi fa schifo solo a tagliarla. When she finishes making a mess, get her out of here. It makes me sick just looking at her. The words hit Lucy like a physical blow to the ribs. It wasn't the insult itself that paralyzed her. She had been called worse by drunken line cooks and angry tourists. It was the language. The sounds violently ripped open a door in her mind she had kept bolted shut for a decade. Suddenly she wasn't standing in a greasy Chicago diner. She was 7 years old, hiding under a wooden table in Sicily, smelling the sharp scent of lemon trees and copper blood, listening to men with guns scream in that exact same dialect. It was the language her grandfather spoke when he was angry, the language of the life her mother had desperately smuggled her across an ocean to escape. She had buried her heritage under a fake name, a flat Midwestern accent, and a mountain of cheap hair dye. She was a ghost. She was supposed to be deaf to those sounds. The silence dragged out. Enzo snickered a cruel, sycophantic sound and glanced at Lucy to see if she had noticed they were talking about her. Lucy stared at the red wine pooling at the neck of the bottle. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, from a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. The exhaustion burned away, replaced by a blinding, white-hot pride, a deeply buried, inherited arrogance that whispered, "You do not let them look at you like a dog." Logic screamed at her to pour the wine below her head and walk away. He was a killer. He could ruin her life with a snap of his fingers. But her pride was already pulling the trigger. Lucy wiped the lip of the bottle with her cloth. Her movements were suddenly precise, rigid. She leaned over and poured a splash of the dark red Barolo into Matteo's glass. The liquid splashed softly against the crystal. She didn't wait for him to taste it. She didn't ask for his approval. She simply filled the glass to the appropriate measure, then moved to fill Enzo's, and finally the third man's. She set the bottle down in the center of the table with a dull thud. Matteo was already turning his attention back to Enzo, preparing to resume his dressing down. He picked up the wine glass, bringing it toward his lips. Lucy picked up her tray. She tucked it under her arm. She looked down at Matteo Falco. He was still ignoring her. She leaned down. She didn't shout. She didn't make a scene for the rest of the restaurant. She brought her face down just inches from his ear, smelling the sharp cedar and the cold violence radiating off his skin. When she spoke, her voice was a raspy whisper, but the enunciation was flawless. She didn't just speak Sicilian, she weaponized it. She matched his Palermo dialect perfectly, hitting every swallowed syllable, every harsh, guttural note. A bestia morta. Di fame ti sta servendo u vino, she whispered. The starving beast is serving you your wine. Matteo stopped moving. The wine glass halfway to his mouth froze in mid-air. He didn't flinch. He didn't drop it. His entire body simply went into absolute rigid stasis, like a machine that had its power cord suddenly violently yanked from the wall. Lucy didn't stop. She leaned a fraction closer, her voice dripping with ice. E se ti fa schifo tagliarmi, chiudi stocchi. Un vino costa $60. Vivitillo prima che diventa acido come a tofacci. And if it makes you sick to look at me, close your eyes. The wine costs $60. Drink it before it turns to vinegar like your face. For 2 agonizing seconds, the world stopped spinning. Enzo, who had caught enough of the tone to understand something catastrophic had just happened, dropped his fork. It hit his ceramic plate with a sharp, echoing clatter. The third man's hand instantly disappeared inside his jacket, reaching for steel. Matteo slowly, agonizingly slowly, lowered the wine glass back to the table. His knuckles were bone white. The tendons in his neck were strained taut against the collar of his expensive shirt. He turned his head. He finally looked at her. Really looked at her. The lazy arrogance was gone, entirely erased. In its place was a look of sharp, dangerous shock. His dark eyes narrowed, scanning her face, not with disgust, but with the intense, terrifying focus of a predator that just realized the rabbit in its jaws had teeth. He stared at the cheap brown dye job of her hair, the dark circles under her eyes, the set of her jaw. He was dissecting her, trying to reconcile the filthy American waitress with the flawless, street-level dialect of his homeland. His lips parted slightly, but no words came out. The great Matteo Falco was paralyzed. Lucy held his gaze for one terrifying heartbeat. Her stomach plummeted into her shoes as the reality of what she had just done crashed over her. Her pulse hammered in her throat, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Without breaking eye contact, she straightened her spine. "Enjoy your meal, gentlemen," she said, in flat, unaccented English. She turned around and walked away. She didn't run, though. Every muscle in her legs begged her to sprint. She forced herself to walk at a normal, measured pace, down the aisle, pushing through the swinging kitchen doors. The moment the door slapped shut behind her, her knees buckled. She dropped the plastic tray. It clattered against the greasy floorboards. She backed up against the stainless steel prep table, clutching the edge with both hands as her breathing turned ragged. She squeezed her eyes shut, listening to the violent thudding of her own heart. "You idiot!" She thought the cold sweat breaking out across her forehead. "You stupid, stupid idiot!" She had just painted a neon target on her own back. A man like Matteo Falco didn't forget a slight. He didn't walk away from an insult. And more dangerously, he didn't ignore a mystery. In the dining room, the silence at the corner booth was deafening. Matteo stared at the swinging doors for a long, quiet minute. He picked up the wine glass, took a slow sip, and set it down. "Enzo!" Matteo said, his voice terrifyingly calm. "Yeah, boss." Enzo squeaked, his hand still hovering near his holster. "Find out exactly who she is." The remaining 4 hours of Lucy's shift felt like walking through waist-deep mud. Every time the heavy wooden door of Trattoria Rossi swung open, scraping against the uneven floorboards, a spike of pure metallic terror drove itself into the base of her skull. She expected suits. She expected guns. She expected the quiet, devastating presence of Matteo Falco, returning to collect the debt her pride had just incurred. But nobody came. The diner slowly emptied, leaving only the stale smell of fried calamari and the buzzing of a dying fluorescent bulb over the pie case. When Gianni finally handed her the nightly cash envelope, a pathetic, grease-stained paper sleeve holding $32 in tips, he didn't look her in the eye. He just grunted, locked the register, and retreated to his office. Lucy pushed out the back door into the alley. The cold Chicago rain had turned into a fine, icy mist that stuck to her eyelashes and instantly soaked through her thin cotton jacket. The alley smelled of rotting cabbage and wet asphalt. She kept her head down, clutching her cheap vinyl purse tight against her ribs, and walked fast. Her mind was a spinning centrifuge. Adrenaline was a vicious drug. It made you invincible for 30 seconds, and then it left you hollowed out, shaking, and hyper-aware of your own mortality. Her thighs ached. Her jaw was locked so tight, her teeth ground together. She caught the Red Line train just as the doors were closing. The car was mostly empty, occupied by a sleeping man smelling of cheap gin and a teenager with headphones bleeding tinny bass beats. Lucy took a seat facing the doors, her reflection staring back at her from the scratched plexiglass window. She looked a mess. The dark brown box dye was fading at the roots, revealing the pale ashen blonde beneath. Her skin was sallow, bruised with exhaustion under the eyes. She didn't look like a woman who could verbally spar with the head of the Falco syndicate. She looked like prey. "What did you do?" she asked her reflection, the internal voice a desperate hiss. 10 years of running. 10 years of looking at the floor, eating dirt, taking the abuse, and you throw it away over a spilled glass of wine. It wasn't the wine, though. It was the language. It was the sudden, violent exhumation of a world she had buried alongside her mother. She got off 3 stops early and walked the remaining blocks through the damp, shadow-drenched streets, taking 4 different detours to ensure no dark sedans were idling behind her. By the time she reached her apartment building, a crumbling brick structure squatting between a defunct laundromat and a liquor store, her fingers were numb. She unlocked the 3 deadbolts, stepped inside, and locked them again. The apartment was a shoebox. It smelled of ancient dust and the radiator that clanked aggressively in the corner, spitting dry heat into the confined space. There was a mattress on the floor, a single chair, and a duffel bag shoved under the bed. That was it. She owned nothing that couldn't be abandoned in 60 seconds. Lucy dropped to her knees beside the mattress and dragged the duffel bag out. The canvas was rough against her cold hands. She unzipped it, bypassing the rolled-up jeans and the fake Canadian passport, reaching for the hollowed-out paperback book at the bottom. Inside was a roll of cash. She flattened the bills on the floor. $450. It wasn't enough. A new identity, a clean bus ticket to a nowhere town in Oregon, a deposit on a room it took at least $2,000 to disappear properly. 400 wouldn't even get her a decent fake ID in this city anymore. She leaned back against the peeling wallpaper, pulling her knees to her chest. The cold from the floorboards seeped through her thin polyester pants. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes until bursts of static color bloomed in the darkness. If Matteo Falco wanted to find her, he would. He owned the local precincts. He owned the unions. He owned the shadows. She couldn't run and she couldn't hide. She had to go to work tomorrow and act like nothing had happened. She had to become the ghost again. She crawled onto the mattress, not bothering to take off her uniform. She pulled the thin, scratchy blanket over her shoulders, shivering violently as the dampness of her clothes met the dry heat of the room. Every creak of the building's settling foundation sounded like a boot on the stairs. Every sweep of headlights across the cracked ceiling felt like a spotlight. Lucy stared at the water stain above her, tracing its ugly, jagged borders, waiting for the sun to rise, and praying that the devil had a short memory. Matteo Falco did not have a short memory. He sat in the heavy leather chair behind the mahogany desk in his office, staring blindly at the security feeds playing on the monitors to his left. The office was located above a legitimate meat-packing facility he owned. It smelled of rich tobacco-oiled leather and the sharp, coppery undertone of raw beef that drifted up through the vents. It was 3 a.m. A glass of amber liquid untouched sat next to a manila folder. Matteo struck a silver lighter, touched the flame to the end of a cigar, and inhaled slowly. The cherry glowed red, illuminating the harsh, exhausted lines of his face. He exhaled a thick plume of grey smoke toward the ceiling. His mind should have been on the docks. He had just spent the last 3 hours ordering a brutal surgical strike against the dockworkers' union boss, who had conveniently misplaced his cargo. The problem was solved. The product was moving. Blood had been spilled. A message had been sent, and the delicate ecosystem of his empire was restabilized. Yet he couldn't stop thinking about the waitress. He reached out and flipped open the manila folder. Enzo had delivered it an hour ago, looking nervous, sweating through his silk shirt. "Her name is Lucy Davis," Enzo had said, shifting his weight from foot to foot. 28, grew up in a foster home outside Cleveland. No criminal record. Pays her taxes, rents a dump in the South Side. She's a nobody, Matteo. Just a rude, crazy broad. Matteo looked at the photocopied driver's license inside the file. The woman staring back at him had dull, lifeless eyes and dark hair pulled back into a severe bun. She looked entirely unremarkable, a background character in the play of the city, but Matteo knew better. He traced the edge of the paper with his thumb. It wasn't just that she had spoken Sicilian. It was how she had spoken it. The dialect of the deep Palermo slums wasn't something you picked up on Duolingo or in a college elective. It was a closed circuit. It was a language of poverty, violence, and bloodlines. You had to be born in the dirt of it to speak it with that kind of venom, and her eyes. When she leaned in to whisper to him, her eyes hadn't been dull. They had been burning. Beneath the grime and the cheap uniform, there was an arrogant, feral survivor staring right back at him. She hadn't flinched when Enzo reached for his gun. She had expected it. Matteo tapped his cigar against the crystal ashtray. He pulled the secondary sheet from the file, a background check run by one of his contacts in the Chicago PD. He scanned the lines of data. Social security number, birth date, employment history. He stopped. He read the lines again. A slow, dark realization settled in his chest, a heavy weight that felt strangely like anticipation. He picked up his cell phone and hit a speed dial number. It rang once. "Yeah, boss," a gravelly voice answered. It was Carmine, his lead cleaner and tech guy, the file on the Waitress. Matteo said, his voice a low, gravelly hum in the quiet office. "You pulled her SSN. Yeah, Lucy Davis, clean as a whistle." "Too clean," Matteo murmured, leaning forward. "Look at the issue date on the social security number, Carmine." Silence on the line as Carmine pulled up the data on his end. Only the sound of typing, then a sharp intake of breath. Jesus. The SSN was issued 10 years ago, when she was 18. Exactly, Matteo said, taking another slow drag of his cigar. Nobody goes 18 years without a social security number in this country. Not even foster kids. The paper trail before 2016 doesn't exist. No medical records, no school enrollment, nothing. Lucy Davis's was born 10 years ago. She's a ghost, Carmine said, the realization dawning. She bought an identity. A very good one, Matteo corrected. But not perfect. You want me to dig deeper, hit the federal databases, see who she's running from. Matteo stared at the blurry black and white face on the driver's license. The sheer audacity of her action replayed in his mind. The starving beast is serving you your wine. A woman in hiding a woman, terrified of being found, had purposefully drawn the attention of the most dangerous man in Chicago, just to satisfy her own pride. It was a suicidal level of arrogance. He recognized it. It was the same arrogance that kept him alive. "No," Matteo said quietly. "Don't dig in the databases. If she's hiding from someone who warrants a 10-year disappearing act, tripping a federal wire might alert them." "So what do we do?" Matteo closed the manila folder. The physical click of the clasp was loud in the silent room. "Nothing," Matteo said. "I'll handle the Waitress." He hung up the phone. He didn't know why he was doing this. The logical, ruthless part of his brain, the part that had kept him on top of the food chain, told him to put a bullet in her, to tie up a loose end, or simply forget her. She was a liability. She was a glitch in his perfectly ordered world. But as he crushed the cigar out into the ashtray, leaving a smear of black ash, he felt a strange, terrifying thrill pulse through his veins. He had spent his entire life surrounded by liars, sycophants, and terrified men. Nobody looked him in the eye. Nobody spoke to him like that. Lucy Davis, whoever the hell she really was, had looked at the devil and spit in his eye. He grabbed his heavy wool overcoat from the hook on the door. It was time to go back to the diner. Thursday night. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city streets slick and shimmering under the amber glow of the streetlights. Inside Trattoria, Rossi Lucy wiped a damp rag across the surface of table 4. The rag was grey, smelling of diluted bleach and old coffee. She scrubbed at a sticky ring of syrup with mechanical repetition, her mind thousands of miles away. It had been 48 hours since the incident. She had survived Tuesday night. She had survived Wednesday. Every time the door chimed, her heart stuttered, but the Mafia hadn't returned. The crushing paranoia was slowly giving way to a bone-deep exhaustion. Maybe Gianni was right. Maybe they were just too big, too important to care about a tired waitress running her mouth. "Lucy, I'm cutting out!" Gianni yelled from the kitchen, his voice carrying over the hum of the refrigerators. "Lock the front, wipe the prep stations, don't forget to set the alarm." "Got it," Lucy called back, not turning around. She heard the heavy thud of the back alley door slamming shut. The locks engaged with a heavy clack. She was alone. She let out a long, shaky breath, her shoulders dropping 2 inches. The silence of the empty restaurant was a balm. She finished wiping the table, tossed the rag over her shoulder, and walked toward the front entrance to flip the neon open sign off and lock the deadbolt. She reached for the brass latch. A large, gloved hand appeared from the outside, resting flat against the glass door. Lucy froze. The blood drained from her face so fast she felt dizzy. The door was pushed open, heavy and deliberate, forcing Lucy to take a step back. The hinges groaned. Matteo Falco stepped into the diner. He wasn't flanked by his massive guard dogs. He was alone. He wore a dark wool overcoat, the collar turned up against the night chill, his hands buried in his pockets. He brought the smell of the cold street, expensive cologne, and dark tobacco into the stale air of the restaurant. He didn't say a word. He turned around calmly, twisted the deadbolt on the door, and flipped the neon sign to "Closed." The click of the lock sounded like a vault sealing shut. Lucy stood perfectly still. Her mind screamed at her to run for the kitchen to grab the chef's knife from the magnetic strip to break a window. But her body betrayed her. Her feet were cemented to the linoleum. Matteo turned to face her. His dark eyes swept over her, moving with a terrifying, predatory slowness. He took in the rigid posture, the white-knuckled grip she had on the dirty rag, the rapid rise and fall of her chest. He was cataloguing her fear, and he seemed entirely unbothered by it. He walked past her. He moved silently, his expensive leather shoes making no sound on the cheap floorboards. He slid into the nearest booth, not his usual corner booth, but one right in the middle of the room, forcing her to be trapped in his orbit. He sat back, pulling his hands from his pockets, and rested them on the Formica table. "I want a coffee," he said. His voice was standard English, low rough, lacking the guttural violence of Tuesday night, but laced with a quiet command that demanded absolute obedience. "Black." Lucy stared at him. Her mouth was dry. She swallowed, trying to find her voice. She had to play dumb. She had to be Lucy Davis, the tired American waitress. We're closed," she managed to say. Her voice trembled, and she hated herself for it. Matteo didn't blink. He just stared at her. The silence stretched thick and suffocating, wrapping around her throat like a physical hand. He didn't repeat the order. He didn't threaten her. He simply allowed the weight of his presence to crush her resistance. Lucy broke eye contact first. She turned her legs feeling like lead and walked behind the counter. Her hands were shaking so badly, she knocked a stack of paper napkins onto the floor. She ignored them. She grabbed a thick ceramic mug, poured the dregs of the bitter-burnt coffee from the carafe, and walked back to his booth. She set the mug down in front of him. The black liquid sloshed slightly. "Anything else?" she asked, staring at the middle button of his shirt. "Sit down." "I have closing duties." "Sit down, Lucy." Hearing her fake name in his mouth sent a shock-wave of cold dread through her nervous system. He knew her name. Of course he did. Slowly she slid into the booth opposite him. She kept her back rigid, perched on the edge of the vinyl seat, ready to bolt. The table between them suddenly felt entirely too narrow. Matteo didn't touch the coffee. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The proximity was overwhelming. She could see the faint stubble on his jaw, a small, faded scar pulling at the corner of his left eyebrow. He looked tired, but the intensity in his eyes was blinding. "Lucy Davis," he said, slowly testing the syllables. "Born in Ohio. Bounced around foster care. A ghost in the system." Lucy kept her face blank. She dug her fingernails into her thighs under the table. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, forcing a flat Midwestern twang. "If you want to talk about my background, you can ask Gianni. He has my resume." Matteo smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. It was a slight upward curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. It was a predator baring teeth. "You did a good job," he said quietly. "The paperwork is solid. The accent is good. You look exactly like the kind of pathetic, beaten-down nobody that this city chews up and spits out." He paused, leaning a fraction of an inch closer. "But you slipped, ragazza." Lucy's breath hitched. She forced herself to look confused. "I don't understand what you mean. The wine was an accident. I apologize." Matteo's expression hardened. The amusement vanished, replaced by a cold, sudden anger. He reached across the table, his movement so fast she didn't have time to flinch. His large, rough hand clamped over her wrist, pinning it to the table. His grip was like a steel vice. It didn't crush her bones, but the absolute, immovable strength of it sent a spike of panic straight into her heart. "Don't insult my intelligence," he hissed, his voice dropping an octave. The English vanished. The harsh, scraping Palermo dialect returned, filling the space between them. "Pensi che sogno un babbo," he demanded softly. "Do you think I'm a fool?" Lucy stared into his dark eyes, her pulse hammering against his grip on her wrist. She tried to pull her arm back, a frantic, animalistic jerk of her shoulder, but he held her effortlessly. "Let me go," she said in English, her voice rising in panic. "Rispondimi," he commanded. "Answer me." "I don't understand you," she lied, her voice cracking. "Please, I just want to go home." Matteo stared at her. He studied the genuine panic in her eyes, the sweat beading on her forehead. For a second, a flicker of doubt crossed his face. Had he imagined it? Had the exhaustion of his life finally caused him to hallucinate? I tightened his grip slightly, his thumb pressing against the rapid, fluttering beat of the pulse on her wrist. "Dimmi così," he whispered, the dialect rolling off his tongue like dark poetry. "Tell me who you are. Unni imparasti a parlare, a così cu ti sta cercando. Where did you learn to speak like that? Who is looking for you?" Lucy clamped her jaw shut. Her eyes burned with unshed tears of pure frustration. She wanted to scream at him. She wanted to tear her wrist away, grab the hot coffee and throw it in his face. The words of her native tongue were bubbling up in her throat, a violent, desperate need to fight back, to match his arrogance with her own. But she looked at his eyes. She saw the cold, calculating intelligence staring back at her. He wasn't trying to hurt her. He was probing. He was setting a trap. He wanted her to break character. He wanted her to admit that Lucy Davis was a lie, because the moment she spoke that language again, he would own her. She swallowed the bile rising in her throat. She let her body go limp, slumping slightly against the booth. She let the tears spill over her eyelashes, making her look small, pathetic, and broken. "I'm sorry," she sobbed, the Midwest accent thick and wavering. "I don't know what you're saying. Please, Mr. Falco, I don't know anything. Just let me go." Matteo stared at her. The silence in the diner was broken only by the ragged sound of her breathing and the distant hum of the refrigerator. Slowly the anger faded from his eyes, replaced by a deep, calculating intrigue. He didn't believe her. Not for a single second. The panic was real, but the confusion was a mask. He could feel the tension humming in her arm, the rigid control she was exerting to keep the act together. She was good. She was very, very good. Matteo slowly uncurled his fingers, releasing her wrist. Lucy instantly snatched her arm back, pulling it against her chest like a wounded animal. She didn't wipe her tears. She just stared at him, breathing heavily. Matteo picked up his overcoat. He stood up, towering over her in the narrow booth. He looked down at the mug of black coffee, then back at her. "You play the victim very well, Lucy," he said in English, his voice smooth and detached again. "But victims don't look back when you insult them. They look down." He turned and walked toward the door. He unlatched the deadbolt, the sound echoing loudly. He pulled the door open, letting the cold, damp wind rush into the diner. He paused on the threshold, turning his head slightly to look back at her over his shoulder. "Ci vedremo domani," he murmured a promise, wrapped in a threat. "I will see you tomorrow." The door clicked shut behind him. Lucy sat alone in the booth, staring at the black coffee. She touched her wrist where his fingers had burned into her skin. She had survived the trap, but the dread in her stomach was heavier than before. He didn't just want to punish her anymore. He wanted to dismantle her. And worst of all, she realized as she stared at the empty space he had left behind, a terrifying, buried part of her wanted to let him. Friday, Saturday, Sunday. He came every night. Matteo Falco didn't bring his muscle. He didn't bring the stifling, ozone-heavy aura of impending violence that usually accompanied his syndicate. He simply brought himself. He arrived at exactly 10 minutes to closing the heavy brass bell above the door, chiming its cheerful, oblivious note, signaling the start of Lucy's daily psychological torture. He always sat in the same middle booth. He never looked at a menu. He ordered black coffee, drank exactly half of it, left a crisp $100 bill on the Formica table, and walked out. He didn't speak Sicilian again. He barely spoke English. He just watched her. It was a systematic, calculated dismantling of her sanity. Lucy felt his gaze like a physical weight pressing between her shoulder blades while she wiped down the counter. It was a suffocating pressure, the feeling of a microscope lens burning a hole through an ant. By Tuesday, the lack of sleep had hollowed out her face. The skin under her eyes looked bruised a deep, sickly violet. Her hands trembled so badly, she dropped a stack of ceramic saucers, the crash, echoing loudly in the empty diner. Matteo didn't flinch. He just watched her drop to her knees to sweep up the jagged white shards, his dark eyes tracking the frantic, jerky movements of her hands. "Leave it," he said. His voice cut through the hum of the fluorescent lights, low and flat. Lucy froze a piece of broken ceramic, digging into the pad of her thumb. A tiny bead of blood welled up bright red against her pale skin. "I have to clean it. Gianni will take it out of my pay." I said, "Leave it." She stayed on the floor for a long moment, the linoleum cold against her bare knees. She wanted to scream. She wanted to throw the broken saucer at his face, to shatter that arrogant, impassive mask. Instead, she stood up, grabbed a rag, and wiped the blood onto her apron. She walked back behind the counter, refusing to look at him. On Wednesday, he brought a box. It was a plain white bakery box, tied with a thin red string. He didn't order coffee. He just slid the box across the table toward her when she approached. "Open it," he commanded. Lucy stared at the cardboard. The smell hit her before she even touched the string. It was a scent that bypassed her brain entirely and punched her straight in the stomach. Fried pastry dough, sweet ricotta, a sharp, bright tang of candied orange peel and toasted pistachios. It was the smell of Sunday mornings in Palermo. It was the smell of her grandfather's kitchen before the screaming started. Her breath grew shallow. She reached out her fingers, clumsy and thick, and pulled the red string. She lifted the lid. 6 perfect cannoli sat in a row. Not the cheap, soggy, Americanized versions filled with overly sweet vanilla cream. These were authentic. The shells were blistered and dark, filled with sheep's milk ricotta that had been strained to a dense, rich perfection. "A bakery in the West Loop," Matteo said, leaning back in the booth. His eyes never left her face. He was searching for the crack in the ice. "The owner is an old man from Bagheria. He imports the ricotta himself. It's a taste of home." Lucy's throat closed. The urge to vomit warred with an intense, violent wave of homesickness. Her eyes stung. She dug her fingernails into the palms of her hands, using the physical pain to anchor herself to the present. He knows, she thought, the panic, a cold, writhing snake in her belly. He doesn't know my name, but he knows what I am. "I don't eat sweets," she said. Her voice was surprisingly steady, a flat, deadpan Midwestern drone. She closed the lid. The cardboard scraped against itself. "Do you want your coffee?" Matteo stared at her. The muscle in his jaw twitched. For a fraction of a second, she saw real frustration in his eyes. The trap hadn't snapped shut. "No," he said softly. He stood up, leaving the box on the table. He leaned in the scent of cedar and expensive tobacco, briefly overpowering the smell of the pastry. "Keep them, Lucy. Throw them away. But don't pretend you don't smell the orange." He walked out, leaving her alone with the box. Lucy took the box out to the alley and shoved it to the very bottom of the dumpster, burying it under rotting lettuce and coffee grounds, sobbing quietly, desperately, into the sleeve of her cheap coat. Thursday night brought a bitter, driving sleet that coated the Chicago sidewalks in a treacherous layer of black ice. Gianni had locked up early, leaving Lucy to take the garbage out alone. The alley behind Trattoria Rossi was a lightless tunnel, a wind tunnel that channeled the freezing air right through her thin jacket. She dragged the heavy plastic bags over the asphalt, her boots slipping her muscles, screaming with fatigue. She just wanted to sleep. She wanted to lock her deadbolts, pull the scratchy blanket over her head, and disappear. She hoisted the first bag into the dumpster. As it hit the metal bottom with a dull thud, a sound cut through the whistle of the wind, the crunch of ice under a heavy boot. Lucy whipped around. Her heart hammered a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. 2 men stood between her and the street. They weren't wearing expensive suits. They wore oversized, puffy jackets, their faces half hidden by dark beanies. They smelled of cheap weed, stale beer, and damp wool. Opportunists. Street-level predators who had watched a tired, isolated woman walk into a blind alley. "Hey there, sweetheart," the taller one said, his voice a nasal sneer. He took a step forward, pulling his hands out of his pockets. In his right hand, a folding knife clicked open. The dull silver blade caught the faint orange glow of the distant street lamp. "Hand over the purse, and whatever you got in the apron." Lucy backed up. Her shoulder blades hit the cold, rusted metal of the dumpster. There was nowhere to go. The fire escape was 10 feet above her head. The back door to the restaurant was locked from the inside. "I don't have anything," she said, her voice shaking. It wasn't an act this time. The terror was a physical blockage in her throat. "I have $30. Take it." She fumbled with the clasp of her cheap vinyl purse, her numb fingers slipping. "Don't move so fast, bitch," the shorter one barked, stepping up beside his partner. He grabbed her arm, his grip bruising, and slammed her hard against the brick wall. The impact knocked the breath out of her lungs. Her head cracked against the masonry, sending a flash of white-hot pain through her skull. The purse dropped to the slushy ground. "Let's see what else you got," the taller man muttered, stepping into her space, the point of the knife hovering an inch from her stomach. His free hand reached out, grabbing the collar of her jacket. Something inside Lucy snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. 10 years of submission, 10 years of looking at the floor, bowing her head, and eating dirt simply evaporated in a blinding surge of inherited cellular rage. The ghost of the frightened waitress vanished, replaced by the feral cornered animal underneath. She didn't scream for help. As the man grabbed her coat, Lucy dropped her weight. She slammed the heel of her boot down onto his instep with every ounce of force she possessed. The bone crunched. The man let out a wet howl, dropping the knife. Before the shorter man could react, Lucy twisted. She didn't throw a proper punch, she used the environment. She grabbed his heavy winter coat with both hands and drove her forehead straight into the bridge of his nose. Bone shattered. Blood exploded in a warm, coppery mist across her face. The shorter man stumbled backward, clutching his face, gagging on his own blood. The taller man was recovering, lunging for the dropped knife. Lucy kicked it away, sending it skittering across the ice into the storm drain. She spun around her chest, heaving, the metallic taste of adrenaline flooding her mouth. She stared at the two men, groaning on the freezing asphalt. Her hair had fallen out of its severe bun, plastering to her bloody, sweat-drenched face. Her breath plumed in the freezing air like dragon's smoke, and then the words tore out of her. They weren't English. They were raw, guttural, and violently Sicilian. "Lasciami stare, pezzi di merda!" She spat the dialect, ripping from her throat like jagged glass. "Leave me alone, you pieces of shit. Vi scipulocchi culli me manu. Toccimi un'altra volta e ti taglio a gula. I will rip your eyes out with my hands. Touch me again, and I will slit your throat." The two men stared at her, terrified, not by the words they couldn't understand, but by the sheer, unhinged violence in her eyes. The bleeding man scrambled backward on his hands and knees, scrambling for traction on the ice, before bolting toward the street. The other limped frantically after him. Lucy stood alone in the alley. The silence rushed back in, broken only by the ragged wheezing sound of her own breathing. She looked at her hands. Her knuckles were bruised and smeared with the man's blood. She squeezed her eyes shut, a sob tearing its way up her throat. She had survived, but she had lost. The mask was gone. The language was out. Clap, clap, clap. The slow rhythmic sound of a slow hand clap echoed from the deep shadows near the mouth of the alley. Lucy's eyes snapped open. The blood in her veins turned to ice water. Matteo Falco stepped out of the darkness. He wore his dark overcoat untouched by the sleet. He didn't look surprised. He looked utterly darkly vindicated. He stopped 5 feet away from her, his eyes scanning the blood on her forehead, the wild, feral posture of her shoulders. $30. Matteo murmured his voice, a low, terrifying purr. They almost died for $30. What a tragedy. Lucy couldn't move. Her muscles flooded with lactic acid, and adrenaline locked tight. She stared at him, wiping a smear of blood from her cheek with the back of her trembling hand. "Did you send them?" she whispered. Her English was gone. The harsh Sicilian dialect rolled off her tongue, naturally a bitter surrender. Matteo's eyes darkened, a flash of genuine insult crossing his features. He stepped closer, towering over her. "Pensi che giumanu sti cani di strata pifari ume travaggiu." He replied the shared language, a sudden intimate wire pulled tight between them. "Do you think I send street dogs to do my work? Then why are you here?" she demanded, her voice cracking. "To watch," he said simply. He closed the distance between them. Lucy braced herself against the cold brick, expecting him to grab her to strike her. Instead, Matteo slowly reached into his coat pocket. He pulled out a perfectly folded, white linen handkerchief. He reached out, his movements deliberate and unhurried. Lucy flinched, turning her face away. "Stand still," he commanded softly. He pressed the linen to the cut on her forehead. His touch was an agonizing contradiction. His hands were the hands of a killer, calloused heavy, capable of crushing her windpipe in seconds, but the pressure of the cloth was startlingly light. He held her jaw steady with his other hand, his thumb resting against her pulse point. He smelled of rain cedar and gunpowder. She smelled of cheap bleach, sweat, and other men's blood. "Lucy Davis is a corpse," Matteo whispered, his breath warm against her temple. "She died just now. Whoever you really are, she is the one standing in front of me." Lucy closed her eyes. The rough texture of the brick behind her, the stinging cold of the sleet, the warmth of his hand on her jaw, it was all too much. The absolute exhaustion of running crashed over her like a collapsing building. "If you're going to kill me," she whispered, her voice a hollow, defeated rasp, "do it. Don't play games anymore. I'm too tired." Matteo's hand stilled. He lowered the bloody handkerchief. He looked down at her, his expression unreadable in the dim light of the alley. "Kill you," he repeated softly. He let out a low, breathy sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. "Why would I kill the only interesting thing in this god-forsaken city?" He let go of her jaw, taking a half step back, though he kept her trapped between his body and the wall. 10 years, Matteo said, his eyes tracing the faded brown dye of her hair, the cheap, blood-stained uniform. "You hid for 10 years. You learned to walk like a peasant, to speak like a Midwestern farm girl, to let filth like Johnny treat you like garbage. But the moment you are backed into a corner, you break a man's face and curse his mother in the dialect of the Palermo slums." He tilted his head, his dark eyes burning with a dangerous, possessive curiosity. "Who did you run from, ragazza?" he asked, the Sicilian word, a velvet trap. "A rival family, a husband, a father." "None of your business," Lucy spat, pushing herself off the wall. She tried to step around him, but he simply shifted his weight, blocking her path effortlessly. "It became my business the moment you poured my wine and insulted me to my face," Matteo countered, his voice dropping to a gravelly threat. "I own the ground you are standing on. I own the port you breathe the air from. I do not tolerate mysteries in my city." "Then shoot me." Lucy exploded, her fists clenching at her sides. The raw, unfiltered emotion ripped through her exhaustion. "You want to know who I am? I'm nobody, I'm a ghost. My family is dead. My name is dead. And the only mistake I made was letting a spoiled, arrogant monster like you hear me speak." She shoved her hands against his chest, intending to push him out of the way. It was like pushing against a concrete pillar. Matteo didn't budge. Instead, his hands shot out, wrapping around her wrists. He slammed her back against the brick wall, pinning her arms above her head. The impact knocked the breath out of her again. The sleet bit into her exposed neck. Matteo pressed his body against hers, trapping her completely. His face was inches from hers. The mask of cool, aristocratic detachment was entirely gone. His eyes were wide, feral, and pitch black. The civilized mob boss vanished, leaving only the ruthless territorial predator underneath. "Do not ever push me," he hissed, his voice vibrating in her chest. Lucy stared up at him. She was terrified. Her pulse hammered against the tight grip of his fingers. But beneath the terror, a sick, twisted spark of adrenaline flared to life. She was bleeding, bruised, and pinned to a wall by a murderer, but for the first time in 10 years, she wasn't pretending. She didn't have to shrink. She didn't have to apologize. She glared back at him, her chest heaving against his coat. "Allora ci fai," she challenged him, slipping back into Sicilian, her voice dripping with venom. "So what are you going to do? Mi ammazzi o mi lasci giri? Kill me or let me go?" Matteo stared at her mouth, as she spoke the rough syllables. He felt the wild, erratic thud of her heart against his own. He was a man who demanded absolute control, who built his life on predictability and fear. This woman was chaos. She was a liability. She was a spark in a room full of gasoline. Slowly the anger drained out of him, replaced by a dark, terrifying clarity. He didn't let her go. He lowered his face until his lips were hovering just a breath away from her ear. "Neither," he whispered, the English words carrying a chilling finality. He loosened his grip on her wrists, sliding his hands down her arms to cup her face. His thumbs brushed over her cheekbones, smearing the rain and the blood. "You are not a ghost anymore," Matteo said, quietly, his eyes locking onto hers. The possessiveness in his gaze was absolute. "Ghosts don't bleed. Ghosts don't fight. You think you survived tonight because you are tough. You survived because I allowed it. Because I wanted to see the monster hiding under the waitress's skin." Lucy swallowed hard. The fight drained out of her, leaving her hollow and trembling. "What do you want?" "I want the truth," Matteo said, stepping back, releasing her entirely. The cold air rushed between them, but the invisible tether remained pulled tight. "And I want you out of this filthy diner." He turned and walked toward the mouth of the alley. He stopped at the edge of the street lamp's glow, glancing back at her over his shoulder. "A black car will be waiting outside your apartment at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning," he said, his voice flat, returning to the ruthless businessman. "Pack your bag. If you run, I will find you. If you go to the police, I will find you. And if you are late." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Matteo stepped into the shadows and vanished. Lucy stood alone in the freezing rain. She slowly slid down the brick wall until she hit the cold asphalt. She pulled her knees to her chest, burying her face in her arms. She had spent 10 years running from monsters, only to realize she had just walked directly into the arms of the devil himself. And the most terrifying part wasn't that he caught her. It was that she knew she was going to get in the car. The mask is off, and the real game has just begun. If you are captivated by Lucy's raw survival and the dark, volatile chemistry between her and Matteo Falco, smash that like button right now. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss an episode of this intense mafia romance. Share this video with a friend who loves gritty high-stakes drama and leave a comment below. What do you think Matteo will do with Lucy once she gets in the car? Let's talk about it.